Good afternoon, and welcome to our ninth annual Affordable Homeownership Summit. Thank you so much for joining us virtually again this year. My name is Dakari Griffin, and I lead the Center's Homeowner Hub, a sophisticated, dynamic, multimedia knowledge and referral center that directly assists English and Spanish-speaking homeowners, plus many other languages through our language line. The Hub staff is a diverse group of trained experts who triage homeownership issues, engage homeowners with compassion, build trust, and refer them to counseling, legal services, and other products and services for which they may qualify. I'm going to be your MC throughout the day, so I'll be here to guide you through our different sessions, just as we guide homeowners to solutions, including many of the homeowner champions watching this event right now. In this opening session, we'll watch an exciting discussion between the Center CEO, Christie Peale, and the keynote speaker, Vanessa Perry, Professor and Vice Dean for Strategic Initiatives at the George Washington University School of Business. Vanessa is also a non-resident fellow at the Urban Institute's Housing Finance Policy Center. Attendees, you will see a chat box directly to the right of the live stream video. That's where you can chat with other audience members. There's also a Q&A box to the right, which allows you to submit questions that will go to panel moderators in later sessions for consideration. If you are having technical difficulties, check out our FAQs up top for how to get support, or click the red icon in the lower right corner. With that out the way, let's introduce the Center CEO, Christie Peale. Thank you.
Thank you, Dakari. It's wonderful to be here with you and everybody else again at our Affordable Homeownership Summit. I'm Christie Peale. I'm the CEO and Executive Director here at the Center for New York City Neighborhoods. And it is my distinct pleasure to introduce Vanessa Perry to you today. You heard a little bit about Vanessa from Dakari just now. She is, as we've noted, a professor, a Vice Dean for Strategic Initiatives at George Washington University School of Business, and also with the Urban Institute. Her research is focused on consumers and housing and financial markets, marketplace discrimination, and public policy interventions, and has been published extensively. And we'll make sure we share links for some of her work, which is really, really inspiring and invigorating. I also wanted to mention for all of us working in the affordable homeownership space here in New York City that Professor Perry acted as a senior advisor at HUD and also was the expert in residence for the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB. So as you can imagine, she's known as Dr. Perry, Professor Perry, and Dean Perry. But today we're proud to welcome her as Vanessa. So welcome, Vanessa. We're so thrilled to have you with us today.
Thank you so much, Christie. I am just thrilled to be here today. This is just awesome. I am really excited about all the great work that you all are doing. And so I'm just pleased to be able to be here to kick off this summit. Uh-oh, you're on mute.
Why don't we, I think we're going to start with some slides that you prepared for us today.
Awesome.
Here we go. Should we go to the first slide?
Sure, please do. Or the second slide.
Yeah.
Yeah. There you go. So you're probably wondering what this is. This is actually a picture of the cemetery where my grandparents, several aunts and uncles, multiple generations of my mother's family are buried in McClellantown, Pennsylvania, which is a little place about 40, 50 miles or so outside of Pittsburgh. And if this picture was taken in 2019, I believe, And what you see, what is stark about this cemetery is the fact that it is divided by a white fence. That is actually the same cemetery. And it is segregated by race. The sort of pristine, nicely laid out, well manicured side is the side where the white people are buried. And the Black people are buried on the side that looks, overgrown and disheveled. And I like to show this picture because I've been going to this cemetery my whole life. And I can remember being about 5 or 6 years old, asking my parents why it is every year we had to go and we had to cut the grass and plant flowers and do all this maintenance to these graves where our family members were buried. But the other side, that was already sort of done. And I think that those conversations are probably what inspired me to start studying racism and discrimination. Because just as you see here, when you divide people, even in the same location or next to each other, you get uneven outcomes. And again, this picture was taken just before the pandemic. And still to this day, the company that owns the cemetery does not engage in maintenance on a regular basis the way they do for the white side of the property. So on the next slide, this is really intended to convey the complexities that we face when we think about the homeownership gap, the racial wealth gap, and how we got here. This is intended to depict the legacy of systemic racism and cumulative disadvantage. And it's got a lot of arrows and lines, and the way to read this is to sort of focus on the elbows. So, we find ourselves in this situation where Black and brown people have limited access to home ownership opportunities today because of this complex set of interrelationships. So historical racism and discrimination and redlining affect both the supply of units, that is sort of the supply of housing and the housing that's available, but it also affects access to credit and mortgages, which people need to buy the houses. Due to segregation and discrimination and redlining, residents of Black neighborhoods tend to have inferior educational and employment opportunities, a lack of development and investment in these areas. We know, for example, that neighborhoods that were redlined back in the 1930s to this day have lower incomes, higher poverty rates, less educational attainment. They're actually literally hotter and more likely to flood. They're hotter because there's more concrete and cement cover and fewer trees in these neighborhoods, as studies have shown. Residents of these neighborhoods have lower life expectancies and higher infant mortality rates. Again, these practices stopped formally in the 1930s, but still the evidence we see in these outcomes today. Home values in these neighborhoods are significantly lower, even though the residents of these neighborhoods pay relatively higher property taxes. So that means lower housing wealth, less wealth in the form of equity accumulated among residents, even those who own homes in these areas. There's considerable recent evidence that home appraisals are biased, such that home values in these areas are artificially lower. And we know that residents of these areas are more likely to be targeted by predatory lenders. They are now, they certainly were in the time period leading up to the 2008 financial crisis. and much of the equity lost during that crisis is yet to be recovered. Last but certainly not least, we have restricted zonings, which, in many areas inhibits the development of affordable units. And so this limited supply pushes prices upward. And so the reason why we have seen house prices skyrocket, particularly in the pandemic, has to do with all of these constraints on the units and access to them. At the same time, on the mortgage side, we have another set of complex, interrelationships going on. Because of the discrimination that people of color face in employment and labor markets, incomes are lower even for the same jobs. Rates of unemployment are higher. Due to the lack of intergenerational wealth, student loan and other kinds of debts tend to be higher. Savings are harder to accumulate. Credit scores are more likely to be either missing or impaired. So people of color are more likely to be rejected for mortgage credit or end up paying more for mortgages due to loan level pricing policies and higher mortgage insurance. One study found that Black households pay over $13,000 more over the life of a loan just to have the same mortgages. So the traces of discrimination, even discrimination that occurred generations ago, are still present in our market and have led to the homeownership gap that hasn't budged since the passage of the 1968 Fair Housing Act.
So what I think is so important about this is that it helps us understand why our work is not just so challenging, but why there is never any one silver bullet, right? You can see how complex these forces are in creating, sort of a really tight web that we have to push against, and how interwoven and interconnected they are. We used to say that our work sits at the intersection of consumer protection and community development, but I think now we have to say it sits at the the three-way intersection of consumer protection, anti-racist, policies, and community development, right? And more, right? You just need to continue to kind of push in all different areas. So as we think about, how complex the forces are that have made the situation very challenging, and we haven't even talked about the existing economic environment, right? With interest rates going up and a potential recession. So how can we think about how to sort of both unravel all these forces and push forward at the same time, if that makes sense?
Well, it's a great question and a complicated one because we have these sort of complicated causes. But honestly, I think the first thing we need to do is we need to acknowledge the underpinnings and what caused the circumstances in the first place. So there have been lots of very well-meaning, very smart, very committed people and efforts and organizations that have tried to close the racial wealth gap and the homeownership gap for many years. Unfortunately, many of their efforts, while well-meaning, didn't really do much because they addressed a different set of problems and not the underlying problems, which are really traced to sort of racism and discrimination that was enabled initially by the federal government. So, we've just got to acknowledge that. And we can tweak and we can continue to tweak the system, but the bottom line is that our system was designed explicitly, intentionally, to exclude people of color. That was what it was designed to do. And so if you continue to tweak this system, you're not going to get anything that's radically different. You're certainly not going to enable any innovation because you're tweaking a system that had this sort of unethical, irresponsible goal in the first place. There's a lot of victim blaming. that occurs. We heard a lot after the 2008 financial crisis about people who didn't know what they were doing, but the truth is that they were victims of some very elaborate schemes to defraud them. And so this bootstraps narrative that we hear all the time, people work really hard and they save their money, they can become homeowners and realize the American dream. Well, that's also kind of the smoke and mirrors explanation that really I find offensive in many ways, because it suggests that it gives a pass to all of the past racism and discrimination, and suggests that somehow or another this is the fault of people who had nothing to do with the circumstances that they were born into. If you don't believe this, and I have tried to convince many people across the sort of political spectrum of how insidious these policies were, just take a gander at the 1938 FHA underwriting manual, which explicitly gives directions to lenders and underwriters to consider the racial composition of neighborhoods in their evaluation of risk. And so, what would make you think that anything in that manual is worth salvaging and certainly keeping in place? But it does have it includes the fundamental components of the underwriting system that we use today. It is now automated and we use artificial intelligence and all of that, but the factors that we use are the same factors that were attempted to be captured in that 1938 archaic, racist document. Sounds like a long time ago, but my parents were born in the 30s. So we're not talking about a long time ago. There are people who are still alive who can remember very well when it was, explicitly prohibited for Black people to be given mortgage credit in many parts of the country. Another question, why is the supply of housing so limited? Well, a lot of it goes back to sort of the racial and economic segregation that we have inherited. The disparities in sort of access to services and amenities across neighborhoods are huge. And in New York, they're really stark. So what does this mean? It means that there are fewer homes available because everybody wants to live in the same places. Why is mortgage credit so hard to obtain? Because the underwriting guidelines were not designed for Black and brown borrowers. So the requirements are prohibitive. Why do homes in Black and brown neighborhoods where people reside have lower appraised values? Well, it's because of the biases in the systems that we use and the methods that we use to appraise the value of homes. So the solutions need to match the underlying problems in order to really move the needle and be effective.
Why don't we go to the next slide and talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So these, in my view, are priorities. And I love acronyms. So, apologies, but I try to come up with acronyms to help my students remember things, and it helps me remember things too. And so this acronym is SAFE. So I'm hoping that we're all moving towards safe homeownership, where the S stands for supply. A supply of a wide range of housing units, not just at the higher end, not just in the $800,000 range, but available for all income levels. We need housing that is affordable. So again, housing that is at all available at all sort of price levels, but we also need access to mortgage credit that is affordable, that does not charge people more simply because of their circumstances. We need housing that's fair. So we need to, there are actually some really, really strong laws at the federal, state, and local level that protect home buyers and homeowners and home seekers, and we need to make sure that they are enforced. And last but certainly not least, we need housing that is environmentally sustainable, that can help us withstand, climate change and these sort of natural disasters that we're seeing more and more of every year.
Well, I think this is really, really exciting, and it's interesting because going back to your experience at the CFPB, there was a big debate about, what is affordable homeownership, what is sustainable homeownership, and thankfully, I feel like this conversation is heard less these days, which I feel is positive. But we used to hear a lot, well, homeownership is only good for certain people, right? People with more means, wider families. I think there's been a really helpful pushback against that, understanding the racist origins of homeownership as a concept in the U.S. And our moral obligation to push back against that. But I think this idea of safe homeownership is really powerful to be able to say it's we're not sending people into the open market to compete with cash buyers, right? That's not what we're talking about. We know that the market is regulated both on the supply side and on the mortgage product side. Left to its own devices, will produce wealthier, wider buyers and borrowers. So sorry.
Oh no, I was just agreeing. Yeah, absolutely.
So I think it really kind of helps, ground our work in principles that can be captured in a new underwriting approach, can be captured in a new way of developing affordable homeownership supply, but also, reminds us, we can't do all of this if we're not focusing on climate change, right? We can't do all of this if we're not also making sure that the regulatory environment is supportive. And it can't just be left up to the regulators, right? As you pointed out in your article called Dog Parks and Coffee Shops on Faux Diversity, regulations alone don't create community, right? So we always need to be taking a comprehensive approach, which can be challenging.
Can be challenging. Oh yeah.
Are there other ways in which you think the affordable homeownership community can think more about fair housing, not just from making sure that folks are able to buy, but folks are able to remain in their homes?
I think that, and I'll use the word sustainability, but from not the environmental perspective in this example, but helping people stay in their homes is absolutely critical. Black households lost, Black and brown households lost a lot of ground in the 2008 financial crisis due to foreclosures. And even though the federal government and local governments did, I think, a really, really good job at staving off a foreclosure crisis at the start of the pandemic isn't over. And it looks like so many people are predicting we are moving into a recession. And what happens then? People lose jobs, and we have, more struggles for people to be able to remain in their homes. So on the fair housing side, I think that things like helping people stay in their homes, representing people, making sure that they're not victimized by scam artists and fraudsters, all of those things are really, really very important and part of this fair housing umbrella that is an important component of the kind of safe homeownership framework.
Well, one other piece on the sort of counter-cyclical nature of our collective work, as we are preparing to help folks think about how to maintain their homes in the face of property taxes. We mentioned the interest rate environment, not just for purchases, but for people that are seeking COVID mods, as you said. There are all sorts of implications on adjustable rate mortgages. But can we also, going into a recession, think about how we need to be prepared on the other side. I feel like we tried to do this after the Great Recession, and we may not have done the best job. We know we have to be ready to bounce back so we don't get victimized again.
Yeah. We need to be thinking ahead and thinking about, yeah, in this interest rate environment with house prices the way that they are, we're not really going to see any quick turnaround in the home ownership gap. But so let's get ready for what happens when interest rates fall again. Let's think about, savings plans. Let's think about alternatives to traditional forms of credit and credit scores. Let's get all those things in place now. So let's think about, the lack of fair access to information about available properties, et cetera. Let's get all those things in place now so that when we come out of this economic cycle, we'll be ready.
I love it. I think that is being ready is where we need to be. We need to be ready to make these changes and envision a new marketplace, right? And a new way of doing this all. We are so inspired by your work and hope to continue the conversation. So thank you so much, Vanessa, and I'm looking forward to our work together. In this
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and I look forward to working with you as well.
Wonderful. Back to you, Dakari.
Hello again. Thank you for joining us for that incredible keynote discussion between Vanessa and Christie. As they mentioned, there are a host of priorities to consider when envisioning a thriving neighborhood. We are thrilled to host this summit where experts from various fields can dive deep to explore innovative solutions and consider exactly what it takes to foster sustainable, affordable, and most importantly, thriving neighborhoods. Now it's time to head back to the main agenda page on your screen and click on the link for our first panel titled, What Helped My Neighborhood Thrive? It starts at 1:30. Feel free to stretch before we jump in.